Hello, nice to meet you all. My name's Peter, and I'm coming at you from Australia, where I can say good morning because it's about 5:30 in the morning for me, and everything's topsy-turvy. We're almost at winter here. But thank you very much for joining me in this session. As I say, my name's Peter. I run a small online learning business in Australia, in Melbourne, Australia, and we're very interested in xAPI here in the Asia Pacific region. So I really love the work that Torrents do in the States in evangelizing what is a marvelous technology. Very keen to be part of the xAPI party, but unfortunately the majority of it takes place at a time in the morning which I'm afraid I'm asleep. So I got up for this session and I'm looking forward to seeing the recordings of what you guys have been enjoying so far today. One of the things that I'm asked a lot about is xAPI data privacy. It's a fairly natural question, and I will tell you why people ask it. As we know, xAPI is a learning analytics dream, as I put it here. There's so much information we can collect. In the late 1980s with AICC, we were collecting the first learning analytics. It was usually little more than did somebody pass or fail. In the early part of this century, we had SCORM, and with SCORM we were able to collect a little more information. We were collecting how people navigated through a course. We were talking about whether they launched a video, how they answered questions, those kinds of things. And then, of course, more recently with xAPI, we've added to that. We've learned whether people actually watched the video, whether they fast-forwarded it, scrubbed it, and whether they navigated the path that we intended through the course, or whether they moved backwards and forwards through our course, that sort of thing as well. So we're now collecting far more information. And also, one of the things we can do with xAPI is look at how they interface with how they interact, with the screens. We can look at whether they clicked a particular button, for example, and yes, or whether I've noticed somebody's mentioned, or whether they jumped the Easter egg and that sort of thing as well. So yes, there's lots of information. And, when we get into it, we can start to get a little bit uneasy. I should say, by the way, and thanks, David, for reminding me, I'm quite open to questions, for example, so please ask them as we're going. So we can now collect information like this sort of thing, and xAPI can extend outside of a learning management system. We recently did a project for a university where we used xAPI to collect information from the student's library when somebody borrows a book. Yes, well, if you're the xAPI Master Challenge ladder, yes, totally. There's another xAPI data point, all sorts of things we can do. And the other thing we did at the university is we connected their Teams chat. So now as students interact with one another online through a forum, hopefully to do with their learning, but perhaps not. That's all collected with xAPI. It's starting to sound a little bit queasy, isn't it? I'd be interested. Use the thumbs up message on your screen to let me know if I'm starting to make you uneasy. So when I get to the point where you're thinking, not happy, click that thumbs up for me and let's see how that goes. Now have I made you unhappy? How about this? Whether artificial intelligence that's looking at the xAPI messages, Well, they connected artificial intelligence at this university to their xAPI statements, and now they can tell whether you're going to fail in advance. They predict from your behaviours, from correlation between behaviours you're exhibiting now and people that have come before you, whether you're characteristic of a student who might in future fail. It's starting to get, yes, creepy. What about if you left your homework to the last minute when you actually submitted it? At the moment, we know whether the homework, learners know, or educators, I should say, know when you've submitted your homework. It's interesting that we can now tell whether you submitted it late, at the last minute. I've seen examples of where people have taught customer service and then used xAPI after people left the course to measure what customers are saying about that person when they returned to their job, and link that to courses, ostensibly to find out, how effective the course is at customer training, but also it does say how somebody's going. And it's, ratemyprofessor.com, exactly, that sort of thing too. So it does start to get a bit concerning. I mentioned before that they're looking at people contributing to chat rooms. Sure, what they're mainly interested in is how engaged is the student? Are they contributing to discussions, which is true. But it does actually also save who they interacted with. It builds a network. This person is frequently connected to others. That's great. And here are the people they connected to. The question I'd ask is this: what is xAPI? xAPI is actually not of itself something very new. It's a standard that says not a great deal more than this. Let's make 3-word phrases, 3-word sentences, if you like. Actor, verb, object. And you've been listening to various speakers talking about that today, I'm sure. Actor, verb, object. And if xAPI of itself is frightening, well, then so is an awful lot of what I'm telling you right now. My speech is largely sentences, and sentences themselves are actor, verb, object. So it's more a linguistic thing. It's not the problem. The fact that we can construct phrases like that is not the issue. What we're talking about is what we do with that information. And when we think of it like that, well, it's a different question. It means that, well, okay, all information we collect could be misused. Does xAPI open up a new avenue for that? Well, probably not really. It's just, as I say, it's just communication. It's just a sensible way of recording events. And it doesn't, it's not even, it doesn't of itself create a new mechanism for doing that. It just says that if you build something, if you go and create something that's going to send messages, make those messages actor, verb, object. So xAPI doesn't ship with something that even constructs those phrases. It doesn't do that. We go out and we go and build tools that make actor, verb, object. All xAPI of itself tells us to do is make them actor, verb, object. So I would change the question. I would quite change the question to this. I would say xAPI is a great tool that causes us to need to think seriously about how we use data, how we use the information we collect. And we have had that conversation over the recent years, with the emergence of big data. There's a lot of discussion. There's new legislation in Australia. We have what we call the privacy principles here, but in Europe, they have GDPR. In America, they have legislation in different parts of the states. There's federal legislation, but I know California, for example, is one state that's got some quite interesting state-based legislation on privacy. And when legislators look at the way xAPI or any other data is to be regulated, they ask these kinds of questions. Okay, let's get back to the fundamentals. What are we collecting? Why are we collecting it? How do we collect it? Perhaps, how do we tell people that we're collecting it as well? How do we reveal that? How accurate is it? That sort of thing. What we do with it. And of course, how safely we store it. How much risk is there that somebody else might get access to our information? So a sensible discussion around xAPI data privacy starts with the same questions for the reasons I've just outlined. xAPI of itself doesn't open a new challenge that we don't already possess. As a matter of fact, as we're going to see, if anything, xAPI makes it relatively easy to do these things compared to a lot of data which doesn't have these kinds of considerations built into it. xAPI makes assumptions that you're going to want to be careful with your information. And so it actually has some pretty good mechanisms for you. But it is open to you not to use them. I would argue that you will regret it if you don't. And we'll talk about that in just this slide. So the reason I say you will regret it if you don't think carefully about the way you use data is this. It's not for the reason you might be thinking. It's not actually for a data privacy reason in the first instance. It's because if you don't think carefully about the way you use your data, xAPI will not be of value to you at all. I can tell you that most xAPI implementations, I'm not just talking about my own. I went to see some sessions at the TD conference in America in Washington, DC, back a couple of years ago before COVID prevented me traveling to the States for the last couple. Unfortunately, I'm so looking forward to getting back there. I can't go this year in Florida, but next year, hopefully. When we were there was a very interesting session talking about an implementation of xAPI, one of the first implementations, and how a group of people had gone in and had a look at what had been done. And this is what they found. And it's a story I've heard so many times. Wow, this is cool. Let's collect everything. The first thing that the university I mentioned said to me was, oh, yes, collect it. Every time I said, do you want this? Oh, yeah, collect it, collect it, collect it. Great, we'll use it. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Wow, that's a lot of work. It's typically the second response. Boy, we spend an awful lot of time building all those learning record providers, collecting all this information. Oh, thank goodness, that's all done. Took us so long. Oh boy, we're collecting a lot. Wow. How many statements is that we've got? Boy, that's a big database. It's getting bigger. What were we trying to do in the first place again? Can you remind me what we set out to do with this xAPI thing? I'm not sure I can give you that report anymore. I'm a bit swamped with data here. I'm not quite sure what that means. Was that statement collected in that context or this context? We've got 3 different equivalent statements telling me that the student did this sort of thing. I mean, we're looking at both the way they progressed the course. We're also collecting which button they clicked. Which one should we use? And then eventually somebody will say, let's sit down and talk about this. And usually the outcome is, let's strip it back and start again. And by the way, 3 consultants were delivering that message at the TD conference. And this is the point at which they were brought in. The organisation concerned had got to stage 4 and were scratching their heads, drowning under a plethora of data that they could make no sense from. And so the consultants had written a conference paper about their experience at step 5. And usually after the reboot, a minimalistic reboot where things are started in a very clever and very targeted and focused way, xAPI really comes to the fore. And that is the reason I say best practice xAPI starts with a consideration of what you're going to collect. Let me just say to you all, how about you save yourselves a lot of anguish and a lot of money and start at step 5. Don't go through that miserable process of let's collect everything before you learn that that was an error, because you will. If you start like this, what are our goals? Good ones might be, hey, we've got 15 different LMSs in the place. And then there's that old system that so-and-so runs in that department and nobody quite knows what it is, but we better not touch it because it might be used. And oh yeah, and then there's that video archive over there. Oh, and of course, we just bought that LXP, right? And it's starting to get a bit difficult to coordinate them all. We'd really like to get the data together so that we can have some consistency across the organisation. xAPI is really good for that. And if that's your goal, consolidation, it's a good goal. Write it down. Our goal is consolidate data. Another very valid goal, and something that xAPI does really well, is, hey, we want to do continuous improvement on our training. And so to do that, what we really need to do is correlate the training we deliver to the outcomes. And so we're going to go back to the real world and we're going to measure how much improvement people demonstrate after our training if we deliver it this way, as opposed to how much improvement do they demonstrate when we deliver the training that way. That's a really legitimate and interesting field of study that xAPI does facilitate so well, correlating training with outcomes and taking data collection outside of the classroom. If that's it, if that's your goal, use outcomes data to improve training design might well be your mission statement. And another one that people often want to do is, backward design correct. And another thing that people often want to do is to incorporate practical assessments. So a lot of training is not really conducive to, the traditional multiple choice quiz. If what you're trying to do is train drivers, hey, isn't it really good if rather than sit them down in a fictitious sort of artificial environment and ask them questions, you send them out to drive and you tell the truck or the bus or the train, often train drivers are assessed this way, I know firsthand that, you tell the train to report how well they did. The train can report whether they stopped at the right point of the station. It can report what the weight of the train was and what the weather conditions were. Trains are pretty smart these days. They've got a lot of computers in them, and they can report all of that. I'm an amateur pilot. My plane, if I wanted to, I could rig it up to xAPI, and it could tell you all sorts of information about how well I'm flying on the particular day, and that could be linked back to my training. So that sort of practical assessment in certain industries is really important, and xAPI can make that very, very, very easy to implement. Now, if that's your goal, write that down. Now, some of you are no doubt thinking, oh, well, I'd love to do all three. That's okay as well. But don't try and do all three at once. Do them one at a time. Get one right, then move on to the next goal. They're separate projects. Each of them warrants its own consideration. So we start with our mission statement. From there, we derive, okay, these are the goals we're going to set. Based on those goals, we can say, okay, well, this is the analysis we'd like to see to know whether we're achieving those goals. We'd like to graph this, or we would like to chart that, or we would like to prepare this report. Once we've got our goals, then we can say, this is the data we need. And when we're collecting that data reliably, we can start preparing really good reports and analysis that enable us to make use of the data. xAPI implementation best practice, let me tell you, is very much a thought process. Data should not be the first thing. That's lazy and it's useless. What you will do is you will get good results if you start with an awful lot of thinking. I'm doing an xAPI project right now for an entire nation, actually, a nation who wants to build a nationwide training learning ecosystem, which is really exciting. And I can tell you the thinking, we haven't put any developers onto it yet. The thinking is going to take months, and it should. It deserves that effort. So the first question, what we collect, ought to be minimalistic. So that's the first thing. We're collecting data. If you want a good outcome, we're only going to collect data that links directly to known outcomes, known purpose. And one of the important things that's always stated in legislation around data privacy is the purpose of data collection. So once we've thought about it like that, it takes care of itself. How do we collect it? Well, have a look at this. Most of the sorts of mission statements you might begin with handle that for us as well. Most data we don't need, for example, to identify people. If what your goal is to consolidate data, you probably aren't adding any new identification. That data that's in all those systems has probably already got some identification. xAPI is not going to need to add any new personal information. If your goal is outcomes analysis, almost certainly you don't want any identifying information either. You're looking at a statistical population analysis to do that. If what you're trying to do is something more like an assessment, then probably you do need to collect information about the people. But there's a good reason for it in that instance, and you can think carefully about how you do that. So the second part of it starts to take care of itself as well. And xAPI has got great mechanisms to support you. So, for example, when we talk about actor, verb, object, the actor is the noun. It's the person, if you like. We think of it as the person. Actually, if you look at the xAPI standard, it isn't necessarily. It can be group. xAPI doesn't require you to send statements that are identifiable for what it calls an agent what we in everyday life would call an individual. So when you hear the term agent in xAPI speak, it's an individual. Yeah, you can send xAPI statements with agents as the actor, if you like, but you're certainly not required to. If it's not necessary for your analysis, don't. Use groups. So there's a question. Would love to hear thoughts on using data to trigger corrective action. Yeah, let me come back to that. So if you have decided that for your application, you want to identify people by group, then xAPI supports two sorts of identified groups, but anonymous groups. It's built into the standard. It's quite capable of having anonymous groups. And for most of the sorts of analysis we're going to conduct, actually, anonymous groups do the job. But even if you need identified groups, xAPI standard says, okay, well, I'm going to support 3 ways of identifying the members of the group. And it can be by their mailbox, if that's what you need. It could be by a group overall code. By mailbox, I mean not individuals. I mean an overall mailbox for the group. So a distribution list, if you like. It can identify a group that way. Or by a code that corresponds to the group. Or by an encrypted code. Now, when you think like that, it's giving you a lot of options for keeping your data secure. And let's suppose we decide, no, for our application, the group's not going to do the job. What we need is an agent. We need to keep our data separated by individual. Okay. But then xAPI gives you choices as well. It gives you 4 ways of identifying an individual. It can have the name if you really need it. Pretty rarely do you. It can have a login ID if that's more useful. For example, if the data is coming from a LMS, you might record somebody's login ID. It can have their email, but it can have an encrypted code as well. We mentioned that for group. I'll talk about encrypted codes a little more now. Let's have a look at an actual example here. Now, interestingly, the example I'm going to show you is live, real data about real people. Now, that might sound scary. This is that university project. Can you believe that I'm just happy to show it to you? This is actual students. You can see now why I'm happy to show you the live data coming in. Yes, it's the middle of the night on a weekend for us, so the last data was 23 hours ago. Students are not morning people, right? But we can see they're viewing various courses, and we can even see the systems they used. If they were using chat forums, we'd be collecting that as well. If they were borrowing books, I don't think many people are borrowing books late on a Friday. That all comes in as well. But here's who they are. Now, if you know who that student is, you're better than I am. So this is the raw data collected by the university. And they're using that encrypted code. So there's an encrypted code for each student. No one will ever be able to take this and read it and tell you who they are. We can we can open a statement, and you can see it uses in the actor mbox SHA-1 sum. That word means that's an xAPI term, and it says use an encrypted code. That's what it means. And that is the code. So this data is detailed. It's talking about the fact that they opened a course in an LMS, what the name of the course was, what the short ID of the course was, and we can see the URL, the link to get to the course within their Moodle and that sort of thing. All that's in there. And we know that they viewed it. but we don't really know who they were. Now, you might be saying, well, how does the university make use of that? Well, here's what they do. A learning record provider, perhaps their LMS, perhaps their library, notices something's happened. Let's suppose it was a library event, beg your pardon. It was a library event. Somebody, let's say the student's called Mary Doe. Mary Doe borrowed a book called To Kill a Mockingbird. It sends a message to the LRS, which is not within the university. Our company hosts their LRS in the cloud. So they're sending it out of the facility, but they've changed the name from Mary Doe to some code. Let's call the code 387T4287. And so that is what the LRS receives. It's got no way of knowing that that is Mary Doe. Later on, they go to do some analysis, and they do that at the facility. And so the LRS sends that statement back that this particular code borrowed a book. And during the course of the analysis, they probably just leave it like that. They do mostly population analysis, books borrowed over the student population. You can leave the code there for that. But sometimes they do want to do a little more detailed analysis. They want to look at how Mary Doe is using the library. So the analysis tool has been set up to go back to the original LRP and say, hey, who was the person for whom you gave it this code? Who is this 38T person? And that system can say who that person was to enable them on those instances where they want to identify the person and produce analysis on Mary Doe's library use. But as you can see, it's for a good, well-defined, articulated purpose. But either way, we, their vendor, the people in the cloud, never know about Mary Doe. There's nothing I can do to find out anything private about this stuff. And it comes back to the final question: what do we do with the data? And we just had a look at some of that. But another question to say is another point to make is that does complete our circle. What do we do with our data comes back to our mission statement. So long as legislation will tell you, so long as we are focused on our purpose and we collect data in a way that's conducive to that purpose, and we don't introduce mission creep, then we're acting responsibly. And that's the point. xAPI data privacy is all to do with responsibility. xAPI itself is not scary. People can be scary, but not if they're trying to do their job properly. So guard against mission creep. And legislation tells us all sorts of things about that. And the tools we have for mission creep are good oversight, good policy, transparency and openness with our participants, telling them what we're collecting, when we're collecting it, why we're collecting it, what we're doing to benefit them. Openness. And of course, legislation. The GDPR in Europe and the CCPA in California, in Australia, what we call the Privacy Act. Those are the tools that we can use to guard against mission creep. So, in summary, what I'm telling you is that xAPI data privacy is actually not a new problem. xAPI doesn't introduce something creepy. xAPI provides another mechanism somebody might use to become a creepy person. But what we need to be doing is making sure that we know what we're doing and why. And if we're trying to do our jobs, that's what we want to do anyway. What's really good, as we saw, xAPI has been built to support that good use. So many different options provided to you for making good quality, securely stored, well targeted statements. Okay, so there are many questions around this, and Stephen asked one before, which I'll come back to in a minute. I would welcome any you might have now, and if any information comes to hand and you're interested in how can we store this safely, or if you want to help look through, ask some questions around how you might go about that planning process that I alluded to with the mission statement and working backwards towards your data. If you want some tips around that, really happy to help you at any point. So I'll give you my email address. Please feel free to email me questions if you've got any, or let's have a chat in the forum now. The other thing I should give a plug to is I am current president of the xAPI users group, which is a great forum for these kind of discussions. And I've provided you with a QR code there, and it's free to join. Some great discussions taking place. We have some really interesting speakers too. If you want to stay in touch, that's how you can reach us, the xAPI users group. Maybe just to kick off that, Stephen asked a question about our thoughts on using data to trigger corrective action. Now, it's a really interesting point. It does stray a little bit from data privacy in one sense, but not in another. It's a legitimate mission statement. So I guess the question is, okay, if our goal is that we want to have learning triggered by errors. There's an interesting story about that. In America, there's a chain of bakeries, which loses a great deal of money whenever somebody burns the bread and holds up the production line. And they actually connected their ovens through xAPI to microlearning. And what they do is if a baker makes an error and the bread is burned, the ovens know about that. The ovens detect smoke. They'll detect that the bread has been burned, and will send an xAPI statement triggering microlearning to arrive and help the baker to do something about it to prevent a repeat. Now, how can you do that? Well, there's a range of ways you could do it. You can have a standard course, or you can have something tailored to the circumstances, perhaps different courses based on the type of bread you're cooking, for example, or the type of equipment you're using, type of oven. That's certainly possible. We can make microlearning around that. Now, of course, in this instance, the person who needs the training is at the coalface. They're not in front of a computer. So the course is delivered in one of a number of ways. They can set up a laptop that's available, or a screen that's available at the coalface. But what they choose to do, and what many people choose to do, is deliver it to a mobile device, which is similar to another project I worked in with the Country Firefighting Authority here in Australia, who help us when we have bushfires. And in particular, they're interested in how effectively those people deal with a catastrophe, such as what they call a burnover, when the fire surrounds the truck suddenly and suddenly everything will go deafeningly loud, pitch black, you can't see your hand in front of your face. Temperatures outside the truck are in the hundreds of degrees, able to melt iron. And you've got a team of people sitting in a truck having to wait this out in panic. It's a terrifying situation. The question is, do they know in that circumstance how to respond coherently and tell base where they are so they can be rescued as soon as possible? And of course, it's a mayday call. So in other words, in a situation like that, can somebody be coherent enough to give a good quality mayday call in which they describe where they are? Because of course they can't see. They have to go from their last bearings and describe adequately where they are in circumstances that you and I can't imagine. And we did that work with them. And so of course they do it as a simulation. So in a simulation, they need to call mayday from out in the field, and xAPI is perfect for it. They're outside the classroom. We need to collect data on how well they did, but we need to do it from the field. In that instance, the corrective action, the training, is conducted after they return. But what the xAPI statement does is it picks up, actually it does voice recognition, how coherently the person described their location, and that can then tell us how well that message would have been received. Based on the xAPI statement, people can say, right, this particular form of training works well, or that particular form of training worked well. But they can also look and say, right, well, this particular person needs some retraining before we're going to put them in charge of a truck. So that's the form of corrective action undertaken there. So corrective action can be linked to xAPI. Now, if we think about data privacy angle for that, well, in the CFA case, we're talking about groups. We're talking about a team. So that team would be not identified as individuals. The mayday call is flagged based on group. And teams in the CFA have a code, the truck number. So it'll be the code-based group that we use. So the individuals, if we went and looked at this data, we can't find the individual. We can find the truck number. The baker, yes, it's identified by person, but by encrypted code. You don't need, if all you're doing is responding by sending back a piece of microlearning, you don't need to save the person's name. All you need is their code so that you can send it to them. So corrective action, the two examples that I've seen, neither of them required a name. One of them didn't even require an actor, it required a group. Any other questions? Okay, I think we've reached the half-hour point, and I'm going to hand back to Liz to tell you about the party that's coming up. Don't miss parties. Never miss a party.
Thank you so much, Peter. We're going to go ahead and keep the lounge open for a couple of minutes after the session ends, so that if you have any questions for Peter, he's going to hang out there. We are going to go ahead and try to send everyone else who doesn't have any questions over to room A. And that's basically the end of the party for room B. But again, there's another 30 minutes in room A. Everyone's welcome to it. And it's basically the closing panel and happy hour. So we hope to see you there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Liz.